So thank you very much for this session, for coming here. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Saleem Ali. He, as he himself described, and please, you have every right to sort of, jump in and say, no, you're describing me wrong. He is a Lahori. He's an Echesonian, but he was born in the US. So he says that I am not an ABCD, which is a title that we reserve for many people who are American-born confused desis. He's not. And so he's actually, he's a Pakistani, American, and Australian academic who's a Blue and Gold Distinguished Professor of Energy and the Environment at the University of Delaware, where he is now. But he's been across the world. He's been to all the 6 continents, about 160 countries. He's worked, he's researched, he's studied in all these different places. So you can imagine the wealth of experience he brings with him when he puts down something and he decides to become not just a researcher, but a writer, which through writings that even people like us, who may not be able to delve deep into those subjects as pure science subjects or something, but there's something in there for all of us. We have to look for those connections which he has made in those books. He was also, he's worked a lot on the extractive industry and the linkages, and tries to weave in the element of sustainability in whatever he has worked in and whatever he writes about, which is something personally I'm very vested in, because if we can't talk sustainability, then we really have a very dark future ahead of us. He was also chosen by National Geographic as an emerging explorer, and I envy your life. And with the profile which appeared in June 2010 issue of the National Geographic. He was also selected by the World Economic Forum as a young global leader. I've already told you about his travels, which is one of the reasons why National Geographic chose him. His research focuses on integrative approaches to achieving planetary sustainability through technical and social mechanisms, and it explores the conflicts inherent within the extractive systems and looks for achieving peace within them, which is something which I found very interesting, because there are so many points of interventions that we are always searching for, when we are in the search for peace. And to think that there could be something in an extractive industry system which could lead to peace is something that I found very, very interesting. So in our conversation, and if you can hold the book for our audience, he's actually got 2 books. The other one I'll be touching upon too. This is The Earthly Order. And this was published by Oxford University Press. It is available here in the hall where the bookstalls are. And I would especially like to mention that the royalties from The Earthly Order are being donated by him for environmental education programs in Pakistan, which are sorely missing and which really need any kind of assistance, intellectual assistance, monetary assistance to be shored up, because of the position that Pakistan sort of straddles as far as vulnerability is concerned due to environmental degradation. And on top of that, everything, the climate change umbrella exacerbates our existing vulnerabilities. Another disclaimer, that's a personal disclaimer. I think 9th class की किताब में था एक chapter, Mabel और मैं. Anybody remember that? That was about somebody who was being given books by their friends, and they would have these intellectual discourses, and he would actually, sound very intellectual. And when he exchanged the books, that friend found out that even the papers who had been joined had not been cut. So that means he hadn't really read it, and probably it was like, the reviews of the books that were the reason. Now, I don't have that luxury. Everything was sent to me on email. But it's my own background of not being a pure science person. Academically, I have not. So I will not touch on those points, and I will let him speak about his book, the content, and the point he's trying to put across. So if, so you have spoken about, especially this earthly order. So am I right in assuming that there is order in the universe that people are looking at, and that those who seem to find it, they are like in a comfort zone. And when they find that there is conflict and there is disorder, does that actually make people uncomfortable, or does it spur further inquiry and search for more knowledge? How would it be for you? What spurred you to write this book?
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Afia. It's wonderful to connect with you in person. I've also followed your writings. So yes, regarding your question about whether this book is trying to posit some normative view on order, the reason I wrote this book was that I have come across the term world order in too many places. You know, Henry Kissinger wrote a 700-page book on world order, and you have politicians and journalists, often they use the word world order, new world order. And as an environmental systems scientist, I found that very disturbing, because what it implies is that we can somehow manipulate the way in which humans interact with each other and create an order which is divorced from the underlying natural laws on which we are all dependent. We are living beings, we are dependent on basic chemistry and biology. We cannot escape that, whether you are the president or prime minister of Pakistan, or whether you are someone begging on the street. And so the goal of this book was to suggest that what we need is not new visions of world order, but earthly order, which connects the fundamental laws of nature with social and political systems. And I've had the good fortune of being trained in both the natural sciences and the social and political sciences. So I started off as a chemistry major, and chemistry, I always say, was my first love. And I was very pleased that actually the cover endorsement for this book was written by a Nobel laureate in chemistry, Roald Hoffman, from Cornell University. But at the same time, the book was also intended for a broader audience where we're talking to people in the political sphere. So there's also an endorsement from Isabella Teixeira, who is the former environment minister of Brazil. And one of my other roles, public service roles, is I serve on the United Nations International Resource Panel. And what I found is that the UN Environment Program is often siloed off from conversations at the UN Security Council or those. So that was the motivation for writing this book. It took a long time to write this. It was a very challenging task because I wanted to present the science as well as personal anecdotes, but to do it in a way which doesn't dumb down the material, but is still accessible. So that was the motivation. And I would say that, you know, where we live in terms of our perception of order, the most interesting things happen in that twilight zone between order and chaos. You know, and as someone who studies complex systems, there's a whole field of research called complex systems. And it's important to recognize that complex is not the same as complicated. Complicated systems are ones which have many parts, but each part is very simple and you can actually fix it and then the whole system works. So for example, a car or an aeroplane is a complicated system, but it is not a complex system, because if something goes wrong with the car, it has lots of parts, you can go and diagnose it, fix it, and then the car will start working. Complex systems are ones which have emergent properties, and a lot of natural systems follow those. Emergent properties are such that if something goes wrong, you can't just go and tweak it and fix it. So life is a complex system. That's why when someone dies, you can try and fix them in whatever way you like, but they will not come back to life. So there are some of those very fundamental aspects of complex systems which are predicated in physics, chemistry, and biology. That's the first part of the book. The second part of the book then says, how do social systems interact with the natural systems? And then the last part of the book is political order, where I talk about how we should envisage political systems reconciling with natural order.
It's interesting that you use the word twilight zone. I use it pretty often, but here I tried to stay away from it.
Yes.
And I said, so it's not a binary, and do we jump from one to the other or on, you know, like a gray-colored bridge?
Yes.
Because they do interact. That's what you're trying to say in your book.
Yeah.
They do interact.
And, you know, that's the amazing thing in complex systems is that also you can get order arising after going through a process of complex interactions. And a very good metaphor for that is, aap chai mein doodh dale, you put milk in tea, you've got, so what happens? Initially, you will get these amazing swirls, right, of these currents, which cannot be predicted. That's another very key feature of complex systems, is you can't predict them. And what exact form those currents will take, or coffee and milk the same way. Afterwards, in a little bit, they'll mix and they will homogenize and you get your kadak chai or whatever, right? So it has gone through a process by which you have interacted between the two entities, the milk and the tea, and that's where the most interesting things happen. That's where between order and chaos is where life emerges.
So that's the gray.
Exactly.
That's the gray.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what is your finding that does the order exist more in the world of science, and then when social and social sciences and human behavioral sciences, they try to interact with them, that gray emerges, or is it that the science tries to encroach into that and bring out something completely new?
One of the, at the end of the book, I have these kind of key lessons from the narrative. And one of those is that order can be discovered and invented. There is some fundamental order in nature. You have certain ways in which mathematical processes can describe natural systems. So we know, for example, the fundamental forces of nature in terms of the strong, the weak nuclear force. In fact, the weak nuclear force, Pakistan has a particular claim to that, since Dr. Afia Salam was one of the discoverers of the weak nuclear force. You have gravity, of course, and you have the electromagnetic force. So these, forces, they do present certain foundational order. But beyond that, actually, you have a lot of uncertainty around how natural systems behave and interact. But some of the features of natural systems do play out in social systems, but humans have the ability to also invent order. They can force natural systems into a certain process which is better for them. And that's the real tension for sustainability, because humans are trying to invent order without often discovering what is the underlying order, which is going to constrain them.
So this is a debate also that has been going on in the environment space, that humans try to make things better.
Yes.
Is that an encroachment into the order of science?
Yes.
And, we've seen the humans taking that space that everything is there created for them, and they want all the space, which also belongs to the biodiversity and to the animals and everything. So we want everything for ourselves. So we want that order to reflect our needs and desires.
That's right, yes. And human beings do have a certain agency, and that's a very interesting question in science, which is consciousness. Do other animals have consciousness? We have consciousness in a certain form. And there's a big debate in science as to whether consciousness is a biological phenomenon or is there something more to it than that. Because it is because of consciousness that humans are able to invent order in ways that other creatures are not quite able to. There are some animals like beavers who can create dams and they create certain order, or you have bees are creating beehives, and there's certain reasons why all beehives have hexagon shapes, because that's the lowest energy dimension to create a honeycomb. So you have a natural order which comes from the honeycomb, but it's not consciously done. The bees are not consciously doing that. It's because they know that that's the lowest energy form, and they want to expend the least amount of energy to do it. But humans, they come up with inefficient systems because they have consciousness, they have values, they have other attributes, and that's the real tension. And as people say to me as an environmental systems scientist, are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Do you think we should just let nature run its course? And I say I'm neither an optimist nor a pessimist. I'm a pragmatist. And as a pragmatist, I feel that we need to work with ways in which humans can invent order. If we can adapt to climate change, we can create structures which will make it less likely that people are going to get destroyed in floods and all. Sure, we should do that. We don't have to necessarily feel as though We have to only follow natural systems because we have this attribute.
But, okay, since you mentioned climate change and, the disasters and floods, uh, isn't going in sync with nature is also getting to be a part of that order?
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
I mean,
And
I
you
know
try.
Imrana is sitting over here. We've
Yeah.
been speaking for conserving nature and living in sync with it and not, most of the damages that we do suffer are, they're human induced. I mean, you sit in the path of the waterways, so obviously you will be swept away by the water. So I don't think that nature has actually done anything which is disorderly when the raging torrents came down. That's what they do.
Yes. But I would say that, we are part of nature and we create systems which, just like bees and ants create colonies, we create cities, we do it at a much higher scale. And that's where actually the second book is somewhat relevant as well, because what I have argued is that industrial systems, which humans create, they are now a permanent part of the Earth's basic living environment. And as such, we should consider them as part of the natural system. And there is a whole field which has developed called industrial ecology, which says that industry now, humans have had such a major impact, and we say that we are living now geologically in a time called the Anthropocene, that this is the era of humans, that we should then figure out how to reconcile industry with nature too. Now, that does mean, what you said quite rightly, we try to mimic natural systems. So natural systems, for example, are cyclical. One of the attributes of natural systems are they're not linear, they're cyclical. And so we should try to make industry cyclical. We should think of ways in which we minimize waste. We are able to use the waste more constructively, just as natural systems do.
So where does sustainability fit in this ordered and disorder of human and nature interaction?
Yes, so sustainability is the way by which we can form some kind of steady state, right? Sustainability implies that there is a steady state between how we are consuming resources and how we are able to replenish the resources. And that's the work in terms of the work I've been doing with the International Resource Panel. We try to provide data to do that. And for those of you who are interested in sustainability particularly, Oxford has asked me to write a very short book called, it's in their series called Very Short Introductions. Okay. And I've been asked to write the VSI on sustainability, which is finished, and it will be out in about a year. It's going through the production. So if those of you are interested in just the sustainability, it'll be a very short primer, which gives you what it is to understand sustainability in that way.
So do we see this entire concept that you've just presented? Would Chernobyl be an example of human intervention, the disaster, humans leave that area, and then nature takes over, and there's a thriving forest over there, the wildlife has returned? Is that what you're saying, that it has to be...
That's a great example of resilience, and natural systems do have resilience, and that's one of the features of our pathway towards sustainability is to understand what level of resilience does each system have. And what we found from the Chernobyl example is that, in fact, even radioactive damage can still be reversed, or nature can find ways of coping with that. It's some of the work I do on mining. It's amazing how plants have evolved to deal with contamination. Like in New Caledonia, which is an island in the Pacific where I've done some work off the coast of Australia, New Caledonia has had one of the highest nickel reserves. And nickel, of course, is a very important metal. Now, the contamination of the soil with high levels of nickel, the plants have evolved a way to metabolize the nickel. And so that if you tap the tree, it actually has green sap because nickel salts are green. And it's just like something out of Avatar, but it's basically because of that resilience, that biotic system. Now, there are limits to resilience, and we need to know what are those limits. But Chernobyl is a great example of that. The Bikini Atoll also in the Pacific, where there has been a recovery similarly.
Yeah, and we've seen, I come from Karachi, and we've seen some of the coastal areas. Biosaline agriculture is actually possible. We didn't think it would be, but because of the sea intrusion and the sea water coming in and all the agricultural land being destroyed in the delta. So now there's biosaline agriculture that is being experimented with, and those experiments are proving to be very, very successful. That
Absolutely.
adaptability within nature also is there. So,
Indeed.
so I really, I don't want to take up all the time and not mention the other book, which I
Yes,
found
yes.
extremely interesting, and I want you to speak more on it. But there's just one, staying on this one. So in this interconnected world, natural world, human world, social, political, economic, uh, which most of the world has adopted the SDGs, the UN SDG goals, Sustainable Development Goals. And you've also mentioned, that how do we cannot get the goal 1, which is eradication of poverty, done until we go all the way to goal 7. And somehow, and Pakistan is one example of that, because they are visually depicted as those boxes.
Yes.
The visual imagery, you just Google SDGs and you have this one rectangle with these squares inside from 1 to 17. Somehow it gives the impression that they are all standalone things. You address one, and then maybe you can address the 4th, or maybe you can address the 13th. And Pakistan did, and Pakistan did announce that we have met goal 13, which was the climate action goal. We announced it in 2020. We are sitting in 24. We've had 2 major disasters between 20 and 24. So how do we break those barriers? The mental barriers also, that we can, okay, let's take care of this and we'll be done with it. Because the way I look at it, even before I read this book, I was convinced that we cannot until we reach goal 17, which calls for an interconnected and, collaborative approach and networking. That's what goal 17 is about. We can't do anything about goal 1.
Yeah.
So how do we marry these two systemic issues?
Well, I think with the SDGs, and there is a lot of debate about whether the SDGs were the right format, but they were an improvement on the Millennium Development Goals. And the Millennium Development Goals were very focused just on the natural science aspects to some degree. And there was also, well, I shouldn't say there was this natural science aspect, but they were not really trying to consider the level of detail that you need to
More
reconcile.
quantitative than qualitative.
Yeah, exactly. And so there was that concern. So the SDGs have actually tried to have a much broader bandwidth. And this goal 17 is partnerships, which is basically you need to make sure that everyone is talking to each other, the public sector, the private sector, and so on. The real tension, and this was true of the Millennium Development Goals too, is between environmental action and development where they may not be synergistic. There can be situations where you have trade-offs. And that's partly one of the reasons why I wrote Earthly Order, is that we should be willing to embrace trade-offs. Just even in natural systems, there are trade-offs. Animals have to decide, and evolution in some ways also decides for them as to how long should your fingers be. There's a certain sweet spot. There's a Goldilocks zone on how long they should be. If they're too short or too long, similarly, there's a trade-off on everything that happens in nature. Similarly, with environment and development, there are trade-offs. You can try to have win-win situations, but sustainable development implies that you will have to make trade-offs. For a poor country like Pakistan, we cannot expect people who are living in abject poverty to be attenuated to all environmental issues. They will be, like some things, of course, they need to have water and food and shelter, and they will recognize that natural systems have been eroded to some degree, but there will be livelihood issues which will sometimes be in conflict with them. So that's the other reason why I said, we need to be willing to invent order to reconcile those. We can't assume that there will be win-wins all the time.
So that order, of course, is a new order again.
Yeah, it's an invented one. And, like one example I give, recently journalists have been contacting me about electric cars, the Tesla mania. And people are like, well, why don't we transition towards electric cars much faster? China is doing that and all. And I said to them, the reality is you cannot physically do it because there is a trade-off. You're not using fossil fuels, but you are going to need a host of critical metals for the batteries. You need lithium, you need manganese, you need nickel. Where are you going to mine them? Where are you going to, and there's like, oh, we'll recycle them. I said, first you have to have a stock to recycle. You can't recycle, but we don't have lithium stocks. So, there is a trade-off. So I wrote a little editorial in Nature, which is a leading academic journal, where I basically said, the title of the editorial was, "There's no free lunch in the universe," because, and that's actually going back to a very famous writer named Barry Commoner, who wrote a book called The Closing Circle. In 1973, the year I was born, he wrote this book, which was about sustainability. But he was really ahead of his times. And one of his laws of ecology was, there's no free lunch in the universe. And basically, we need to reconcile that, because I think environmentalism, by its very nature, is kind of utopian. People are always like, there is the Garden of Eden we're trying to go to, and and if we go down that path, it can often lead to despair, because you need to recognize there will be trade-offs. We will not be able to eat the cake and have it too.
So that is actually what this entire book tries to say, that you have to understand there's no perfect system, either in nature or in our human behavioral sciences and in social sciences and social, political, economic interactions, and that all has to evolve with time. There are some places, I know everybody, like you mentioned, utopia, to people like us who have 1.8 tree cover, forest cover. Out of the recommended 25%, we always give the example of Bhutan, which is almost to 90%. But then they don't.
Such a small population. I visited Bhutan. You can't compare.
And then they have this king who orders, and they do it. So no, we don't want kings. We've had kings of different kinds. But in a big population, in an impoverished population, then those trade-offs appear, and it's not really fair to, like you said, that humans think they are doing it right. But which humans and for whom? It's only a percentage of humans will benefit and some will not.
Absolutely.
So that imbalance will still be there.
And now population is a really interesting point. And one of the chapters in Earthly Order is about what I call demographic order. And population is, if you think about population, it's a two-edged sword, because you really have the opportunity to use human capital for developing economies. I mean, that's how China rose, in terms of its development path, was because after the Cultural Revolution, there was, so much widespread poverty and famine, and it was a, terrible time in Chinese history. And then there was a recognition that there's a very large population, and we have to put them to work in some form, and then we have to control them, right? So they tried to make this juxtaposition of the two. Some would say they did the first part in terms of putting them to work pretty well, but they controlled it perhaps too drastically, and now they're having a problem with that. So what happened is, basically we have a term we call the demographic dividend, which is a way by which economists measure whether the population can be put to productive use. So if you can do that, your population is an asset. But if you cannot do that, your population is a liability. And in Pakistan, we have to figure out how to harness our demographic dividend, which is part of this process.
This is a process.
Exactly.
Yeah, because I mean, yes, we do have, we've always flaunt our youth bulge.
Yes.
But if 40% of the children who are being born are stunted and they are malnourished, and we are not able to address that, then that isn't really the dividend that we want to look at. And each year, the number of, the numbers are growing.
Yes.
And we still have those same numbers being released each year. That 2.5 crore children are out of school, they are malnourished, there is a high rate of stunting. So then that becomes a liability rather than a dividend. So we need to address those causes as well.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that's very, very important for us to keep in mind. And on that score, what you mentioned earlier, that you are giving your royalties for support to environmental education, which is something, it's very, sort of difficult to unpack, because when you say education, people usually think of schools, colleges, universities, and I just mentioned there is a large population which is outside those formal setups. So how do we reach them? Are you looking at supporting the formal setups? Are you looking at supporting the informal? Because there's a lot of good work happening in Pakistan for environmental education at the levels of schools, in teachers training, in through theater, through role play, and where some NGOs are doing, some local organizations are helping out, and they are usually, they don't receive the kind of state funding. And the
Yes.
state funding which is there, which is invested into curriculum development, and I know that the curriculum has been developed even to the level of college, which nobody has yet seen the light of day. So how would you be
Yes,
able to assist in this?
So, one of the ways in which I'm trying to do this, and very much so, I'm focused on Pakistan environmental education because of the emotional ties to Pakistan. But the same could be applicable to other parts of the world where I've traveled, and actually most of my field work has been in other parts of the world. But one of the ways is I feel that students need to have foundational learning in environmental system science. So, for example, the Lahore Science Mela, which is held by the Khwarizmi Society. I donated some resources for that because I think that is so important to have that foundational knowledge of science, because it's become also very trendy. You get a lot of the NGO types who like, gee, oh, climate change ki bandwagon pe chalna hai, and without knowing कि भाई है क्या है, क्यों हो रहा है, and that's for me very disturbing, because if you put the cart before the horse, you don't understand. Like the book talks about in complex system, one of the ways complex system science emerged was understanding weather patterns. And there was a researcher at MIT, one of my alma maters, named Edward Lorenz, who actually came up with this idea of how you get weather patterns leading to certain kinds of long-range predictable forecasts. And trying to understand that. So if you understand that foundational learning, then it's much more likely that you will make informed decisions rather than just having this kind of more fashion-oriented approach to environmentalism, which has happened in many countries. Because it's sort of the donor gravy train, people follow that. And so I've tried to go much more to focusing on environmental education at the level of foundational science education.
Yeah, you call it the donor gravy train. Locally, we call it truck ki batti. Everybody's after the truck ki batti. Climate change, environment is that. So without understanding, I totally agree. But in that, as I mentioned about the visual imagery of SDGs, so similarly, our education is also boxed.
Yes.
It's absolutely boxed. So students who are studying science have no notion of how the impacts of that science in the context of climate change and environment is going to impact economics or health or your human psychology. There are disasters, there are mental health issues with people, and we as a society, not just as a country, as a society, we are not very cognizant of issues dealing with mental health and the trauma that comes from these. So maybe those boundaries also need to be broken within our education system. So people have to know the geography. They must know the meteorology of, especially being in a country which is barely slipped out of the top 10 brackets in the vulnerability index. So if I compare the the risk, the threat assessment or threat perception, so that threat perception is not there across the board in society. And we don't really have to throw the science at everybody to explain to them that, look, it's going to have an impact. Literacy skills, even of the people who are children who are going to school, they are not there. The numeracy skills are not there. The literacy skills are not there.
No,
this is a whole new conundrum that has to be dealt with separately.
Absolutely. And then, if you can't get it at the early stages, then at least, with our politicians, we should have opportunities by which they're interacting on environmental systems and having more information in terms of those aspects as well. So, and Pakistan has been actually very fortunate. The good news is that we have had industrialists who are very committed to environmentalism. Of course, Sayyid Babar Ali is well known as one of the real, doyens of green industrialism in South Asia. We've got the Daouds in Karachi who have set up the Magnificent Center, and it's a remarkable accomplishment that they are investing through their philanthropy for foundational science and also environmental science education. But the task is so huge that the scaling requires everyone to be working together. And then the other aspect that has been very promising is that recently Pakistan has shown a leadership role in terms of international environmental policy, whether it's with the Climate Change Convention. Pakistan was instrumental in lobbying for an adaptation, loss and damage fund. And so those are all areas where we should feel proud that the country does have some level of recognition of these matters. And it's also a non-political issue in Pakistan, which is refreshing. And I wrote a little op-ed piece in Forbes. I'm a columnist for Forbes also on sustainability. And I recently my last op-ed was on Pakistan's election. I said, there's plenty of concern and division about it. But one thing which I find really interesting is that all of the political parties, you think about environmental issues, they all are very much pro-environmental action. Which is not the case in the United States.
Oh, they're
it is in the environmental movement has become the fault line between the political parties. And you have an anti-intellectualism which has taken root. And so in Pakistan, actually, there's much greater convergence of views around, like, we have to work on environmental issues, regardless of whether they disagree. And this is, unfortunately, in the US, a relatively new problem. Because I remember the time when Newt Gingrich, for example, those of you who have American connections may know, he was a Republican Speaker of the House, and he wrote a book called Contract with the Earth. And it got a cover endorsement by Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson. Now, if you look at the Republican Party, you will not find that kind of dynamic at all. So it's strange how this has shifted. The Environmental Protection Agency in the US was started by Richard Nixon, who was a Republican. But there it has become a fault line. In Pakistan, thankfully, it is not a fault line in that same way.
Absolutely. And I think this is something very encouraging that right now, because the elections and everything that happened after is still not after. We haven't reached the stage of after. It's still happening. But the very, very hopeful thing, which has nothing to do with just this election, is that there are two projects which were conceived by the outgoing government. I've forgotten what you call these different governments. We've had so many in 2 years. So it was the interim government, right? After, so interim government, it did not go on the usual path that we subcontinentals, I'm not going to only blame Pakistanis, changing names of roads, etc., changing the plaques on buildings. They owned those projects which were pitched by the PTI government. The interim government took them forward, pitched them, which was Recharge Pakistan and Living Indus. And now Living Indus, I don't know how many of you were in the panel yesterday. It has been declared as one of the flagship projects of United Nations, which is a very proud thing for Pakistan, and it was pushed through by the interim government. So I think we are, again, under that layer, like we used to talk about track 2. At that level, there is the realization, that these are all in the national interest. No matter which party comes, when it comes, this is something that we need. Pakistan needs to have these kind of projects go through and, to talk about them and do it collaboratively. So despite all the uncertainty prevailing, it gives hope for a person like me who's more rooted into these environmental issues, that at least now they have this sense, that we can fight over whatever else, but this is something which is existential. This is something that concerns my children, my children's children, so let's just, get it done. So this is a hopeful sign. I think maybe with hindsight, you get that earlier, even these kind of convergences were not there. Everything was wiped out and then started anew. So the good thing is, and if people can stay the course and they can be like the watchdog over the authorities that, look, this is something that you decided was good for the country. So no matter who's there, no matter who comes or goes, let's just, move forward with it. And I know we don't have a lot of time, but I would definitely want the audience in. But before so I think I do definitely want to mention your other book. I found it extremely interesting, and it is, again, because I'm not a science person as such, I could make the connections, but I couldn't really understand all the science in it. So I want him to explain to. So that was From Soil to Foil, which itself is a very intriguing, interesting, And a very simple topic because, and
On one
foil
metal.
over here means, and by the way, since you are a Pakistani and an
Aluminium,
Australian,
yeah.
what is it? Aluminium,
Aluminum. Not aluminum.
Americans call
The
it
American
aluminum and it rattles
pronunciation,
me.
yeah. No, so that book, actually, I was approached by a publisher to write that book because I had written one of my earlier books which is more than 12 years ago, was titled Treasures of the Earth. And it's about minerals and our relation, how minerals have transformed human societies. Like, we talk about the Iron Age, the Bronze Age, and also minerals define human civilization. And so the publisher, which is Columbia University Press, they said, why don't you write a deep dive book on one element, one metal? I said, okay, well, there have been books written on gold, there's books on, a range of other elements, carbon. There's a wonderful book called Symphony in Sea by Robert Hazen. But there hadn't been a book written on aluminium in the same way. And aluminium is actually a fascinating metal because it's the most abundant element, it's the most abundant metal in the Earth's crust. But it was so difficult to isolate because the bonds it forms with oxygen, I think there's aluminum all over. The dust you have around there, those are aluminosilicate rocks which have powdered away. But it was so difficult to extract it. People didn't even know that it was a metal until basically the 18th century, which is really strange because it's so ubiquitous. And so I wanted to do the deep dive on aluminium because it's also an example of our relationship to the elements of the earth more broadly. The reason why we couldn't extract it is because aluminium forms very strong bonds with oxygen, and you need energy to extract it. So for a long time, when they finally figured it out in the 19th century, aluminium was more valuable than gold because it was so difficult to extract it. And people were like, this is so precious. People were making jewelry out of aluminum. Can you believe that? Now our jewelry industry would laugh at it. But that was during the Napoleonic period. That was basically one of those things. They had utensils. And then we figured out, then this is where innovation is important. And the book a lot of it is about innovation. Yeah. Once we figured out how to commercially extract aluminium, the world changed. And now we wrap our sandwiches in aluminum foil and, we've got soda cans in it. But it happened because of that one innovation which required a certain catalyst to extract the metal. And what is really great about it is, and how many of you are undergraduate students here? Anyone? A few? So inspiration for you, the guy who discovered that was an undergraduate student at Oberlin College in Ohio, which is a small college. He wasn't at Harvard and Yale, and Pakistanis are into branding all the time with universities. He was at a small liberal arts college, and he worked with his chemistry professor to perfect this tool of how to extract aluminium. And his name was Charles Hall. As an undergraduate, he became the first CEO of Alcoa Corporation, which is still the world's largest aluminium company. So it's an inspirational story, and the book goes into sort of the storyline, the history of aluminium and all that.
So I found it very interesting because, this is an extractive industry you are talking about, and you use this pretty philosophical quote by Herman Melville, and it says, as in digging for precious metals in the mines, much earthly rubbish has first to be troublesomely handled and thrown out. So in digging in one's soul for the fine gold of genius, much dullness and commonplace is first brought to light. And I found it, it's like a life's lesson.
Yeah.
So I found this fascinating. So of course you've answered whether it is aluminium or aluminum because it becomes like a tongue twister when you're talking to an American. And
so,
it's more recyclable, you said, than all others. And so how do we create a circular economy? Because like you said, it's everywhere.
Yeah,
so what's the recyclability element over here?
Yeah, I'm wondering we should maybe give some time for the questions, and I'll try to wrap this question because we have only like 8-9 minutes.
I know, because we started late, so I thought I would encroach from the others.
People might
absolutely.
So
please.
Then I'll try to come to the question.
Yeah. Addressed to both of you, in your learned opinions, what are the 3 immediate areas that Pakistan needs to address, which are actionable to save us from a climate disaster? Because we are at the forefront of.
Okay.
We are facing immediate hardship, the biblical floods, twice, so on and so forth. We are third world, we are least developed, we do need to burn the coal to power our industrialization, etc., etc. So what do we need to do tactically, which is achievable in the next 3, 5, or 10-year horizon?
Yeah, I mean, my simple response is that we need to think in systems. We should not think about just one problem and try to focus. Like if we say tree planting is the solution. No, you have to multitask. In nature, you can't do one thing. You have to have the bandwidth to look at, and that's what systems thinking is about. So that would be my simple response. Yeah.
My response is something, it's just a one-word response, because we do have systems, we do have the people, as you mentioned. We don't have governance. You know, we have the documents are ready, we have the climate change policy, we have its implementation plan, we have the adaptation policy too. We also have, which was a big task, was the CC gap, which is the Climate Change Gender Action Plan, which has highlighted 6 sectors in which, the neglected sector, the women of this country, who absolutely have everything to do, water, coastal resources, forestry, agriculture, everything is there. But we need somebody with sincerity to be able to follow that through. And this is why I sounded out that note of hope, that earlier one thing prepared by one government was sidelined and then they would start anew. And then this new trend, it's still new. It's what, 3 years old? I still think that if we go forward on that way, maybe we will get what we need. So I am not going to lose hope just yet. As long as we can hound the people and be the watchdogs, I think we can get it.
Okay, great. Yeah, please, yes, please. Here.
This gentleman
Oh,
has
here,
the
oh,
mic,
you
so
have the
you
mic
go
over.
first and then we give the mic over there, please. इनको करने
ठीक
दें,
है, आप
इनके
करें,
हाथ में
आप
था,
एक बार।
तो अब उनसे छीनेंगे नहीं.
Thank you. So
can
my
take-
question is sort of similar already here. So our campaign on the climate change, particularly in Pakistan, that's mostly on the changing the living style. So change like every day the habits, and mostly the things that, even in the newspaper, there's also about the low consumption, those sort of things. Okay, so I just want to ask, is that sufficient, or we need to challenge and change the entire system? So yeah, that's my question.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you need to be able to work at multiple scales, and you need to do some firefighting. If there's a problem, you fight the fire, but you don't want to stop at the firefighting. You need to, so if there is a, water pollution problem, you need to solve that right there and then. But at the same time, you have to think about what is the system that is causing that to recur. And then you have to think about, like in Lahore, I have said, one of my biggest concerns growing up here is the Ganda Nala problem. That is a system level problem, that we do not have good water and sanitation system. That, I remember Zafar Ali Road used to have a terrible nala. The old American consulate used to be there, but they got rid of it. They figured it out. But it was a diagnostic thing. जी वो ठीक है, अमेरिकन परेशान होंगे, तो ठीक करो. उसके बाद बाकी look at the rest of आप उधर जाएं, बैरिया टाउन जो नई जगह बन गई, उधर भी गंदे नाले चल रहे हैं. सारी जगह कोई लोगों ने सिस्टम को बदलने की कोशिश ही नहीं की है. So वो that would be my thing. But maybe.
Yeah, and there's simple fixes. Sorry, I'll just take a minute to give the example. Yesterday, I had to go to Lums, and they allow entry only from one gate, and there's this stench from that nala. Why don't they have the reeds and other plants which are known to, clean up water? It's not even a technical fix. You have these bioremediation water treatment plants now everywhere. And that's the simplest thing to do. You just plant, what are they called? Water hyacinth, or one of the reeds.
Phragmites
At least the smell will not be there. It will not. It's very offensive. And you're going into one of the highest centers of learning in this big city, and you pass through that.
Exactly. Even Islamabad, which was designed by Konstantinos Doxiadis, one of the great, architects of ecological planning, and he said it was his masterpiece, which it is in many ways. It is a very amazingly planned city. But when they implemented it, they said there should have been water sanitation system. Even in Islamabad, you have the Ganda Nalas. You have E11 with, 20 crore का घर है और 7 गंदा नाला है. Shocking. Anyhow, yes.
Please.
Other questions.
A question on the circular economy.
Yes.
So it is a lot on the agenda, for example, in the EU and also in Pakistan. So I'm working in the textile sector. And I'm wondering if we look at the systems and introducing such a complex shift from linear production to circularity, what would be your idea how the mankind could really pursue this complex task? So what could be the entry points to introducing more secular practices in our economic
And that actually ties in with your question earlier on with reference to aluminium, because one of the reasons I wrote Soil to Foil with reference to aluminium is because it's a metal where we have a very good circular economy, and why that happened is because of that material energy nexus. Because it requires so much energy to extract aluminium from bauxite, which is the primary ore for aluminium, that the economies of scale developed around recycling aluminium at a very early stage, which has not happened with other metals as much. But even then, it's not enough. So one of the ways to do it is really to create regulatory mechanisms or cost mechanisms which are going to make it less likely that you have primary or extraction and have a linear economy. But there are dangers to a circular economy too, which I would alert you to. Circular economy, if people start just becoming complacent about it, that, oh, well, we're just recycling and all is good, you can have what we call rebound effect. And the rebound effect can mean that you end up consuming more, even though you are being more circular, right? So, and this is the same problem with hybrid cars or, people end up driving more because they think they're being sustainable. So you have to always keep track of total consumption, that the total consumption is going down. Circularity is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. The end should be total consumption reduction, so you have less impact.
Almost like, you have these flyovers and you have these underpasses because there's congestion. If you monitor, and it's been done elsewhere in the world, they are an old system because after 5 years, it will be as congested because more people are, they are induced, oh, there's less congestion, we can get there faster, let's buy a bigger car, faster car, and you end up at the same point in about 5 years' time. So it should be that more people can use transport at one time rather than a few people can drive fast cars. That's it. So that kind of circularity. The other thing is, it's absolutely correct that you start using things more. If you think, oh, it's being recycled. And I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, but here too it's a matter of governance. We have our national environment quality standards. The circularity can fall within it. The industries, and I can quickly tell you, our industries are complying. Which industries are complying first? Is the industries which are the export-oriented industries, because those compliances are what will get their products into the international market. So you have many of our textile units which have complete circularity. There's nothing going out. They even harvest the steam and they use it back as, the water. So we have that. We have in our leather industry, which is one of the most polluting industries. Some of the industries which are from which the products are sourced by overseas countries in EU, etc., they have very strict compliances. Our automotive industry as well. I think the Toyota plant was set up in 1991. And before the first car was produced, their water treatment plant had been functional. And the water was used to irrigate and green their entire space. They started with 1,000 plants. Some time ago, I went there were 60,000 plants now there from that recycled water. So there are benefits, but then you start using more and more and more. So that's a very good point.
Thank you so much for indulging. We have to. The next group is here, but we can.
Is there any question, or maybe you can catch him outside? Thank you very much. You've been a great audience.